The blade hovers inches from the old man's throat. Tiberius Caesar Augustus, Emperor of Rome, watches from his throne with eyes like winter ice. The condemned senator trembles, waiting for the sword to fall, but the emperor raises one hand. The executioner freezes. "Not yet," Tiberius says softly. "Let him contemplate his fate a while longer. Perhaps a week, perhaps a month. Let him feel every moment of his dying." The guards drag the senator back to the dungeons beneath the Palatine Hill, where he'll wait in darkness, not knowing if this day or the next will bring his end. Around the throne room, courtiers stand motionless, barely breathing. They've learned that the slightest sound, the smallest gesture, might draw the emperor's attention, and his attention is the last thing any of them want. This is Rome in 31 AD, 17 years into the reign of an emperor who transformed governance into an art of refined terror. But Tiberius wasn't born cruel. He was made cruel, shaped by decades of humiliation, forced marriages, and political manipulation until something essential inside him turned to stone. His story, and the stories of 4 other emperors who would follow, reveals a disturbing truth about power. Given absolute authority over millions of lives, the human psyche doesn't just corrupt, it mutates into something barely recognizable as human at all. Rome gave civilization law codes, engineering marvels, and architectural wonders that still stand 2 millennia later. But it also gave civilization something darker, a centuries-long experiment in what happens when one man's whims become indistinguishable from law, when sadism can clothe itself in imperial purple, when cruelty can operate not in shadows, but in broad daylight, sanctioned by the full machinery of state power. 5 emperors stand out, not merely for their brutality — Rome had plenty of brutal men — but for the particular innovations they brought to cruelty, the ways they used absolute power to explore the darkest possibilities of human nature. Their reigns form a descent into increasingly bizarre forms of terror, each emperor finding new depths that his predecessors hadn't imagined. To understand how Rome arrived at this darkness, we must begin not with Tiberius, but with the world that created him. Born in 42 BC into a Rome still convulsing from civil war, Tiberius Claudius Nero grew up watching his mother Livia navigate the dangerous currents of power. She was ambitious, calculating, and utterly focused on advancing her family. When she caught the eye of Octavian, the future emperor Augustus, she divorced Tiberius's father and married into the imperial family. Young Tiberius suddenly found himself stepson to Rome's most powerful man. Picture the boy watching his mother's machinations, learning that love was a currency, that marriages were political tools, that nothing mattered except power. These lessons would shape everything that followed. Augustus forced Tiberius into a marriage with his daughter Julia, requiring him to divorce Vipsania, the woman he actually loved. Imagine Tiberius at his own wedding, going through the motions of celebration while his heart remained with the wife he'd been forced to abandon. Ancient sources say he wept when he saw Vipsania in public afterward, and Augustus, noticing, made sure they were never in the same place again. This was the crucible that forged Tiberius's character. Decades of public humiliation, of being passed over for succession in favor of Augustus's biological relatives, of watching lesser men receive honors he'd earned through military victories. Each slight calcified his soul a little more. When Augustus finally named him heir in 4 AD, after every other candidate had conveniently died, Tiberius was 55 years old. He'd spent a lifetime learning that trust was foolish, that everyone wanted something, that power was the only currency that mattered. And now, suddenly, he possessed more power than any human being on earth. For the first decade of his reign, Tiberius governed competently. He managed finances carefully, administered provinces fairly, and maintained the frontiers Augustus had established. The Senate, which had feared the worst, began to relax. Perhaps this grim, taciturn man would be better than expected. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Tiberius's paranoia, dormant during his years as heir, began to grow. Every senator who spoke too boldly seemed like a potential rival. Every popular general looked like a threat. Every gathering of aristocrats felt like a conspiracy forming. Enter Lucius Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Tall, handsome, and possessed of a talent for manipulation that bordered on genius, Sejanus recognized what Tiberius needed, not a friend, but a mirror for his paranoia. Sejanus began feeding the emperor information about plots and conspiracies, most of them probably fabricated or exaggerated. "The senators mock you in private," Sejanus would whisper. "They toast the memory of Augustus and wish you dead. They call you a usurper, say you murdered your nephew to steal the throne. At first, Tiberius dismissed these reports, but Sejanus was patient. Day after day, report after report, the poison dripped into the emperor's mind. And unlike crude lies, Sejanus's information contained enough truth to be believable. Senators did complain. People did miss Augustus. The boundary between legitimate criticism and treason began to blur. Sejanus's master stroke came in consolidating the Praetorian Guard. Previously, these elite soldiers had been housed in barracks scattered throughout Rome. Sejanus convinced Tiberius to concentrate them in a single massive fortress, the Castra Praetoria, on Rome's outskirts. Now 9,000 of Rome's best soldiers answered to Sejanus alone, and their presence loomed over the city like a permanent threat. The transformation of Tiberius from competent administrator to monster accelerated after 23 AD, when his son Drusus died suddenly. The official story blamed illness. Historians suspect Sejanus poisoned him, eliminating a rival and deepening Tiberius's isolation. The emperor's grief was profound, but it transformed not into depression, but into something colder, a conviction that Rome itself was his enemy. In 26 AD, Tiberius made the decision that would define his reign and doom thousands. He left Rome for the island of Capri and never returned. Imagine the emperor's departure, the long procession winding south toward the Bay of Naples, leaving behind a capital that didn't know whether to celebrate or mourn. On Capri, Tiberius built the Villa Jovis, a palace perched on cliffs 300 meters above the sea. From this remote fortress, Tiberius ruled Rome through correspondence and through Sejanus. And from this distance, his cruelty could flourish without the moderating effect of having to see his victims' faces. The machinery of terror that Sejanus and Tiberius perfected operated with bureaucratic efficiency. The law of maestas treason became infinitely elastic. Criticizing the emperor was treason. Failing to praise him enthusiastically enough could be interpreted as treason. Owning a statue of the emperor in an inappropriate place was treason. Even melting down a statue of the emperor to create a new one could be construed as treason. Professional informers called delatores proliferated throughout Rome like a plague. These men made their living by accusing others of treason. If the accusation stuck, the informer received a portion of the condemned man's property. Suddenly, Rome was full of amateur detectives, noting who said what at dinner parties, who failed to applaud when the emperor's name was mentioned, who possessed wealth worth confiscating. In the Senate House, paranoia became the dominant emotion. Senators learned to speak in platitudes, to avoid saying anything substantive, to praise Tiberius constantly, while saying nothing of actual importance. Friendships dissolved because you couldn't know if your closest companion might turn informer. Fathers stopped confiding in sons, brothers regarded each other with suspicion. The genius of this system was its self-perpetuating nature. Once established, it required minimal effort from Tiberius. The machinery ran itself, fed by greed, fear, and mutual suspicion. The emperor merely had to review cases and pronounce judgment, and his judgments revealed a mind that had moved beyond mere cruelty into something more disturbing, a fascination with psychological torture. When the Senate condemned someone to death, Tiberius would sometimes intervene, not to show mercy, but to prolong suffering. He forbade prisoners from committing suicide, posting guards to prevent it. The logic was financial. If a prisoner killed himself, his property might go to his heirs. But if the state executed him, everything could be confiscated. Imagine being condemned to death but forbidden to end your own life, forced to wait in darkness for weeks or months while the emperor decided your fate. Some prisoners went mad. Others begged their guards for the mercy of execution. The guards had orders to refuse. On Capri, away from Rome's scrutiny, Tiberius's behavior grew increasingly bizarre. Ancient historians, admittedly hostile to him, describe elaborate cruelties. The Villa Jovis became a place where the emperor could indulge his darkest impulses. The cliffs proved useful for disposing of those who displeased him. Bodies would be hurled from the heights, and sailors with clubs waited below to ensure no one survived. Yet throughout this reign of terror, Tiberius maintained his administrative competence. The provinces were well governed. The frontiers remained secure. The treasury grew. He was a monster who made the bureaucracy function efficiently, which made him more dangerous than a simple madman. Rome couldn't dismiss him as insane because his insanity coexisted with capability. The delatores grew wealthy beyond imagination. Some accumulated fortunes that rivaled the old aristocracy. But the system had a fatal flaw. It depended on trust between Tiberius and Sejanus, and neither man was capable of trust. In 31 AD, Tiberius received evidence, possibly from his sister-in-law Antonia, that Sejanus was plotting against him. The emperor's response demonstrated the calculating nature that made him so terrifying. Rather than confront Sejanus directly, Tiberius orchestrated an elaborate trap. He sent a letter to the Senate, ostensibly to grant Sejanus new honors. As the letter was read aloud, Sejanus sat in the Senate house, surrounded by supporters, anticipating glory. The letter began with praise, then subtle criticisms appeared, then open accusations. By the end, Tiberius was demanding Sejanus's immediate arrest. The Praetorian prefect, moments ago the second most powerful man in Rome, found himself seized by the very guards who'd obeyed his every command. Within hours he was executed, his children were murdered, his wife was forced to watch her children die before being killed herself, his body was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber. But Tiberius's revenge didn't end there. He unleashed a purge that made the previous terror seem restrained. Anyone associated with Sejanus, anyone who had benefited from his patronage, anyone who had spoken in his favor faced prosecution. The delatores, sensing opportunity, turned on their former patron's associates with savage enthusiasm. The prisons overflowed. Executions became daily occurrences. One incident captures the particular horror of this period. Sejanus's ex-wife Apicata sent Tiberius evidence that Sejanus had poisoned Drusus years earlier. The emperor's rage knew no bounds. He ordered the execution of Sejanus's remaining children, but Roman law forbade executing virgins. So the executioner raped Sejanus's young daughter before strangling her. Her body was thrown down the Gemonian stairs, where traitors' corpses were displayed for public mockery. Tiberius lived 8 more years after Sejanus's fall, growing more isolated on Capri. He died in 37 AD at age 77, possibly smothered by the Praetorian prefect Macro, who'd replaced Sejanus. When news of his death reached Rome, people danced in the streets, shouting Tiberius to the Tiber. But Tiberius's true legacy wasn't his personal cruelty. It was the system he perfected. A self-sustaining machinery of denunciation that could operate almost automatically, that turned citizens against each other, that made fear the foundation of governance. Future emperors would inherit this machinery and find new uses for it. And the next emperor had learned these lessons well. He'd grown up in Tiberius's household, had watched the old emperor's methods, had seen how fear could be wielded like a weapon. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history remembers him by his childhood nickname, given by soldiers who'd seen him dressed in miniature military boots, Caligula. The Circus Maximus erupts in celebration as the young emperor enters. It's March 37 AD, and Rome has exploded with joy. Tiberius is dead, and in his place sits a 24-year-old prince who represents everything the old emperor wasn't: young, charismatic, handsome, beloved by the army, the son of the legendary general Germanicus. Caligula waves to the masses, and they scream their adoration until their voices crack. He declares amnesty for political prisoners. He burns Tiberius's secret files of accusations. He promises an end to treason trials. He distributes money to the people. He hosts lavish games. For 6 months, Rome believes it has found salvation. Then Caligula falls ill. The sickness lasts for weeks, and when he emerges from his sickbed, something fundamental has changed. Ancient sources disagree about what happened during those fevered nights. Some suggest encephalitis, others propose poisoning. A few whisper that madness had always lurked in his bloodline. His family tree included several suicides and erratic personalities, and the illness simply released it. What's certain is that the man who recovered was not the man who'd fallen ill. The transformation began subtly. Caligula started spending money with abandon, burning through the vast treasury Tiberius had accumulated. He hosted games of unprecedented extravagance. He built pleasure barges on Lake Nemi, so enormous they featured marble floors, running water, and heated baths. He constructed a bridge across the Bay of Naples, not because Rome needed it, but because a soothsayer had once said Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Naples. The emperor rode across his bridge wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, proving the prophecy wrong at a cost that bankrupted provinces. But extravagance wasn't madness. That came later, and when it arrived, it revealed a mind that had completely severed from reality. Caligula began to believe he was divine, not metaphorically, as Augustus had carefully cultivated divine associations, but literally. He ordered a temple built to himself. He had the heads removed from statues of gods and replaced with his own likeness. He would appear dressed as various deities, one day Jupiter, complete with thunderbolt, another day Neptune with a trident, a third day Venus, wearing women's clothing and makeup. When the Senate met, Caligula sometimes attended dressed as a god, and senators were required to worship him. Those who showed insufficient enthusiasm found themselves added to a list the emperor kept, a list of people who would soon regret their skepticism. The cruelty emerged as whim and escalated into systematic terror. Caligula would order men executed, then invite their relatives to dinner and force them to laugh and joke as if nothing had happened. One father, compelled to attend a banquet the day after witnessing his son's execution, sat at the emperor's table, smiled, made witty conversation, and appeared to enjoy himself, knowing that any sign of grief would mean death for his remaining children. The emperor developed a fascination with death itself. He attended executions regularly, offering suggestions to the executioners. "Strike so that he feels himself dying," he would say, echoing Tiberius's old command. He invented new methods of execution, seeking ways to maximize both suffering and spectacle. But Caligula's cruelty had a quality that distinguished it from Tiberius's calculated terror. It was capricious. Tiberius killed for political reasons, real or imagined. Caligula killed because he was bored, because someone's face displeased him, because he wondered what would happen. This randomness made him more terrifying. Under Tiberius, you could try to avoid political entanglements. Under Caligula, simply existing was dangerous. The famous story about making his horse Incitatus a consul is probably exaggerated, but the kernel of truth it contains reveals Caligula's contempt for the Senate. He didn't actually make the horse a consul, but he threatened to, and the threat was the point. He was demonstrating that senators were so worthless, so powerless, that a horse could do their job. He built Incitatus a marble stable with an ivory manger and purple blankets. He invited the horse to dinner. Whether these stories are literally true matters less than what they reveal about how Romans perceived their emperor, as a man who'd lost all sense of proportion. Caligula's sexual behavior became increasingly transgressive. He seduced senators' wives and then publicly discussed their performance in bed, rating them, comparing them, humiliating both the women and their husbands. He committed incest with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, whom he loved obsessively. When Drusilla died in 38 AD, Caligula's grief was so extreme he made it a capital offense to laugh, bathe, or dine with family during the mourning period. He declared her a goddess and ordered empire-wide worship. But his treatment of his other sisters revealed a different side. After Drusilla's death, he turned on them viciously, accusing them of plotting against him. He had them exiled. According to some sources, he prostituted them before their exile, forcing them to sleep with common soldiers as humiliation. The treasury, so full when Caligula took power, began to empty. The emperor needed money for his extravagances, so he revived the treason trials Tiberius had perfected. The delatores emerged from retirement. Accusations multiplied. Property was confiscated. Caligula added his own innovation. He personally auctioned off the possessions of condemned men, forcing senators to bid against each other for worthless items at inflated prices. One senator fell asleep during an auction and woke to discover he'd inadvertently bid millions for a lot of garbage. The emperor invented taxes on everything. He taxed prostitutes, requiring them to pay fees equal to what they charged for one encounter. He stationed soldiers at Rome's gates to collect arbitrary tolls. He taxed lawsuits, marriages, and food. When people complained they couldn't afford the taxes, Caligula suggested they kill themselves, which would at least save them future obligations. One incident reveals Caligula's arbitrary nature perfectly. He demanded that a senator named Sextus Papinius divorce his wife so the emperor could marry her. Papinius refused, an act of remarkable courage. Caligula had him exiled. Then, apparently bored with this game, he recalled him from exile and made him a consul. Then, bored again, he had him executed. The randomness was the point. By making his cruelty unpredictable, Caligula ensured no one could feel safe. You couldn't protect yourself through political maneuvering because politics had ceased to matter. You couldn't protect yourself through loyalty because Caligula's favor could transform into murderous rage instantaneously. The entire empire existed in perpetual anxiety. Caligula's relationship with the army, initially his greatest strength, deteriorated. He planned a military campaign to Germania, then changed his mind. He marched legions to the English Channel, then ordered them to collect seashells as spoils of the ocean. The soldiers, who'd loved him as Germanicus's son, began to see him as insane. The Praetorian Guard started plotting. They'd endured his insults, his arbitrary executions of their officers, his treatment of them as toys. The prefect Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula regularly mocked for having an effeminate voice, became the conspiracy's center. On January 24, 41 AD, Caligula attended the Palatine Games. He was in good spirits, having just sacrificed a flamingo, its blood staining his toga. As he walked through a narrow underground passage from the theatre, Cassius Chaerea struck. The first blow caught Caligula in the jaw. The emperor tried to run, screaming that he was still alive, but conspirators surrounded him. They stabbed him 30 times. The Praetorian Guard, finding the emperor dead, went on a rampage. They murdered Caligula's wife, Caesania, and smashed his infant daughter's head against a wall. The Senate briefly debated restoring the Republic, but the Praetorians found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain and declared him emperor before the Senate could act. Caligula had reigned less than 4 years, but he'd shown Rome something terrifying. That absolute power combined with madness could reduce the greatest empire on earth to a theatre of arbitrary cruelty. Tiberius had been cruel with purpose. Caligula was cruel as performance art, as self-expression, as the natural activity of a god among mortals. Yet Caligula's reign, for all its horror, was merely preparation. The true depths of imperial cruelty remained to be explored. And the man who would reach those depths was already waiting. A boy born into the imperial family who would grow up to make Caligula look almost restrained. His name was Nero. The lyre strings vibrate under skilled fingers. The young man playing possesses golden hair, a weak chin, and eyes that dart nervously around the room even as he performs. It's October 54 AD, and Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, 16 years old, has just become emperor of Rome. His mother Agrippina the Younger stands behind his throne, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder. She's maneuvered for years to place her son in power, marrying Emperor Claudius, convincing him to adopt Nero, possibly poisoning him when the timing was right. Now she expects to rule through her son. This expectation will prove fatal. For the first 5 years of Nero's reign, Rome experiences what historians call the Quinquennium Neronis, 5 years of good government. But this isn't Nero's achievement. The empire is actually run by Seneca the Younger, Nero's tutor and a brilliant philosopher, and by Burrus, the Praetorian prefect. They manage the state while Nero indulges his passions, music, poetry, theatre, and increasingly, his mistress Poppaea Sabina. Agrippina watches her influence wane with growing alarm. She'd expected to be the power behind the throne, but Nero is slipping from her control. She threatens, she cajoles, she reminds him she made him emperor. Nero begins to see his mother not as protector, but as jailer. The breaking point comes when Agrippina opposes Nero's relationship with Poppaea. The emperor wants to divorce his wife Octavia, Claudius's daughter, and marry his mistress. Agrippina threatens to support Octavia, to turn the Senate against him, to undo everything she created. Nero decides his mother must die, but killing Agrippina isn't simple. She's popular with the old guard, respected by many senators, protected by loyal supporters. Nero needs her death to look accidental. He tries poison first, but Agrippina, paranoid from years of palace intrigue, has built up immunity by taking small doses of various toxins. The poison fails. Next, Nero commissions a special boat designed to collapse and sink on command. He invites his mother to a festival at Baiae, treats her with elaborate courtesy, and sends her home on the boat. As planned, the vessel breaks apart in the Bay of Naples. But Agrippina, despite being in her 40s, swims to shore. Standing on the beach, dripping and furious, she realizes her son tried to murder her. Nero panics. His carefully planned accident has failed, and now his mother knows. He sends assassins to her villa. They find Agrippina waiting, defiant to the end. According to legend, she pulled open her robes and told them to strike her womb, the womb that had borne such a monster. They beat her to death with clubs. Nero's reaction to matricide reveals the peculiar nature of his cruelty. He didn't glory in it like Caligula. Instead, he was haunted. Ancient sources claim he was tormented by nightmares of his mother's ghost. He consulted magicians to ward off her spirit. Yet this guilt didn't stop him from killing again and again. It simply added a layer of psychological torment to his crimes, as if he was compelled to cruelty despite himself. With Agrippina dead, Nero's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He divorced Octavia on grounds of infertility, then married Poppaea. When the public protested, he had Octavia exiled, then executed on false adultery charges. Her severed head was brought to Poppaea as a gift. The emperor's artistic ambitions consumed him. He didn't just want to be emperor, he wanted recognition as Rome's greatest artist. He performed in public theatres, singing and playing the lyre, scandalous for a man of his station, unthinkable for an emperor. Senators were required to attend and applaud enthusiastically. Guards monitored the audience, noting anyone who seemed insufficiently impressed. Nero created the Neronia, athletic and artistic competitions modeled on Greek games. He competed himself, and naturally he always won. Judges understood that awarding first prize to anyone but the emperor was suicidal. Nero collected these victories proudly, as if they were genuine achievements rather than enforced flattery. But Nero's place in history was secured by fire, not music. On the night of July 18, 64 AD, flames erupted in shops near the Circus Maximus. Fanned by summer winds, the fire spread rapidly through Rome's densely packed neighborhoods. For 6 days and 7 nights, the city burned. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained untouched. 3 were completely destroyed. 7 were reduced to rubble. The famous story that Nero fiddled while Rome burned is false. The fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. But the story captures how Romans perceived their emperor. Some sources claim Nero watched the fire from his palace, singing about Troy's fall. Others say he was at Antium, 35 miles away, and rushed back to organize relief. What's certain is that Nero used the fire to his advantage. He opened public buildings to shelter the homeless. He brought in grain supplies. He organized firefighting efforts. These actions earned some goodwill. Then he began planning the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, which would occupy over 300 acres in Rome's heart, land conveniently cleared by the fire. Romans whispered that Nero had started the fire himself for his palace. The rumor spread despite his relief efforts. The emperor needed a scapegoat, and he found one in a relatively new religious sect, the Christians. The persecution of Christians under Nero was the first large-scale state violence against this group. Christians were arrested en masse. Under torture, some confessed to starting the fire, confessions almost certainly false. Nero turned their executions into entertainment. Christians were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. They were crucified in Nero's gardens. Some were coated in pitch and set ablaze to serve as human torches illuminating the emperor's evening garden parties. The cruelty of these executions shocked even Romans accustomed to gladiatorial games. The historian Tacitus, no friend to Christians, wrote that despite their guilt, people began feeling pity, sensing they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to satisfy one man's cruelty. The Domus Aurea became Nero's obsession. The palace complex featured a colossal statue of Nero himself, 120 feet tall. The grounds included an artificial lake, forests stocked with wild animals, and pavilions decorated with gold leaf and precious stones. The main dining room ceiling rotated to simulate the heavens' movement. When completed, Nero reportedly said, "At last I can begin to live like a human being." The cost drained the treasury. Nero responded by confiscating wealthy Romans' property on trumped-up charges. He revived treason trials, targeting anyone with significant wealth. He debased the currency, reducing coins' silver content. These measures made him increasingly unpopular with the Senate and wealthy classes. In 65 AD, a conspiracy formed. The Pisonian conspiracy, named after its leader Gaius Calpurnius Piso, involved senators, equestrians, and even praetorian officers. The plan was to assassinate Nero during games and proclaim Piso emperor. But one conspirator revealed the plot, and Nero's response was savage. Hundreds were arrested. Torture was applied liberally to extract names. The conspiracy, probably involving a few dozen people, expanded under torture to implicate hundreds. Nero used it as excuse to eliminate anyone he suspected or anyone whose wealth he coveted. Among the victims was Seneca, Nero's old tutor. Though Seneca's involvement was questionable, Nero ordered him to commit suicide. The old philosopher opened his veins in a warm bath, surrounded by friends, discoursing on philosophy until the end. His wife Pompeia Paulina tried to die with him, but Nero ordered her saved, wanting her to live with grief. Another victim was Lucan the poet, Seneca's nephew. Lucan had been close to Nero, but the emperor grew jealous of his literary talent. When Lucan was implicated, Nero ordered his suicide. Lucan died reciting his own poetry, lines about a wounded soldier dying similarly. The purge eliminated many of Rome's best minds. Nero killed not just for political reasons, but from jealousy, greed, and spite. Anyone more talented, wealthier, or more popular than the emperor became a target. Nero's personal life grew darker. He kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in a rage, then mourned her extravagantly, giving her a state funeral. He found a boy named Sporus who resembled Poppaea, had him castrated, and married him in a public ceremony, complete with bridal veil. He paraded Sporus through Rome dressed as empress, forcing the city to treat this grotesque parody as legitimate. The emperor's behavior became increasingly divorced from reality. He planned a trip to Greece to compete in artistic competitions. In 67 AD, he toured Greece, performing in theaters and competing in the Olympic Games. He won every competition, including a chariot race where he fell out and didn't finish. The judges awarded him first place anyway. While Nero played artist in Greece, the empire began fracturing. In 68 AD, Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, rebelled. He was quickly defeated, but his revolt inspired others. Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself emperor with his legion's support. The Praetorian Guard, unpaid and resentful, abandoned Nero. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Nero fled Rome with a few loyal slaves. As soldiers closed in on his hiding place, he finally worked up courage to kill himself, allegedly saying, "What an artist dies in me." He stabbed himself in the throat with his secretary's help, dying at age 30. Nero had reigned 14 years. In that time, he'd transformed the Principate into a vehicle for artistic vanity and arbitrary cruelty. Unlike Tiberius's calculated terror or Caligula's mad whims, Nero's cruelty stemmed from weakness. He killed because he was afraid, because he was jealous, because he couldn't tolerate anyone who might outshine him. His cruelty was insecurity elevated to state policy. But the story of cruel emperors doesn't end with Nero. After his death, Rome plunged into civil war, the year of the 4 emperors. When the dust settled, a new dynasty emerged, the Flavians. They brought stability and competent governance. Then they died, and the throne passed through several hands until it reached a man who would redefine imperial cruelty once again. His name was Commodus, and he believed he was Hercules reborn. The gladiator's blood sprays across sand as the emperor's sword finds its mark. The crowd roars, but the sound is strange, forced, as if they're screaming because they must, not because they want to. In the imperial box, senators watch with fixed smiles, applauding mechanically. It's 192 AD, and Commodus, emperor of Rome, is fighting in the arena for the 735th time, or so he claims. This is what Rome has become, a stage for one man's delusions. Commodus was born into privilege that would have made Nero envious. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was the philosopher emperor, the last of the 5 good emperors, a man who wrote meditations on virtue while campaigning on Rome's frontiers. Marcus Aurelius broke with tradition by naming his biological son as successor rather than adopting the most capable man available. This decision proved catastrophic. Commodus became co-emperor with his father in 177 AD at age 15. For 3 years, he campaigned alongside Marcus Aurelius in Germania, learning war and governance. But where his father saw duty, Commodus saw tedium. He wanted glory without effort, victory without sacrifice, and above all, he wanted to return to Rome and its pleasures. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, possibly of plague, Commodus immediately abandoned his father's military campaigns. He made peace with Germanic tribes on terms that horrified the Senate, giving up hard-won territorial gains. Then he returned to Rome and never left again. For a few years, Commodus allowed capable administrators to run the empire while he indulged his passions. But unlike Nero's artistic pretensions, Commodus's obsession was violence. He loved the arena, loved gladiatorial combat, loved the visceral thrill of killing. He began training as a gladiator, spending hours practicing with weapons, studying professional fighters' techniques. The Senate was appalled. Gladiators were slaves, criminals, or desperate freedmen. For an emperor to fight as a gladiator was to degrade the imperial office beyond recognition. But Commodus didn't care. In fact, their disapproval seemed to fuel his enthusiasm. In 182 AD, his sister Lucilla organized a conspiracy to assassinate him. The assassin, a young senator named Quintianus, approached Commodus with a dagger, but instead of striking immediately, he shouted, "See, the Senate sends you this." The warning gave Commodus's guards time to react. They seized Quintianus, and the conspiracy unraveled. Commodus's response revealed cruelty that combined Caligula's capriciousness with Nero's paranoia. He didn't just execute the conspirators. He used the conspiracy as excuse to purge anyone he suspected of disloyalty. Lucilla was exiled, then executed. Dozens of senators were killed. The purge continued for months, fed by informers who saw opportunity in the emperor's fear. But Commodus's cruelty took a unique form. He didn't just kill enemies, he humiliated them. He forced senators to fight in the arena. He made them watch as he killed exotic animals, demonstrating his prowess. He required them to proclaim him Hercules, to worship him as a god, to participate in his delusions. The emperor's identification with Hercules became total. He dressed in a lion's skin, carried a club, and commissioned statues showing himself as the legendary hero. He renamed the months after his various titles and names. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the Senate the Commodian Fortunate Senate. He renamed the Roman people the Commodian people. This wasn't just vanity, it was a systematic attempt to remake reality to match his self-image. Commodus wanted to be Hercules so completely, he tried to force the entire empire to accept his fantasy as fact. His arena appearances grew more frequent and bizarre. He fought wild animals, killing hundreds of ostriches, elephants, and other exotic beasts. These weren't fair fights. Animals were often weakened or restrained, ensuring Commodus's victory, but he treated each kill as demonstration of divine prowess. He fought as a gladiator against human opponents, but these fights were equally staged. His opponents used wooden swords or were instructed to lose. Commodus won every fight, racking up hundreds of victories. He charged the Roman treasury 1 million sesterces for each appearance, bankrupting the state to fund his delusions. The cost of Commodus's reign went beyond money. Capable administrators were replaced with the emperor's favorites, men chosen for willingness to indulge his fantasies rather than competence. The frontiers, neglected, began to fray. Corruption flourished as officials realized the emperor cared only about his games. Commodus's chief advisor was a former slave named Cleander, who'd risen through the imperial household ranks. Cleander essentially ran the empire while Commodus played gladiator. He sold public offices to the highest bidder, accumulated vast personal wealth, and ruled through terror. When a grain shortage caused riots in Rome in 19 AD, Commodus sacrificed Cleander to the mob, having him dragged through streets and killed. But removing Cleander didn't improve Commodus's governance. He simply found new favorites to exploit the empire. The pattern repeated: a favorite would rise, accumulate power and wealth, become too powerful, then be destroyed when convenient. The emperor's cruelty toward the Senate intensified. He would summon senators to the palace, then have them watch as he killed animals in his private arena. He would force them to examine corpses, to praise his skill, to participate in degradation of their own dignity. Some senators were made to fight in the arena themselves. Others were simply executed when they failed to show sufficient enthusiasm for the emperor's performances. One particularly chilling incident involved a senator with a physical disability. Commodus had him brought to the arena and forced to fight as a gladiator, mocking his disability throughout. The crowd, required to cheer, watched in uncomfortable silence as the emperor tormented a helpless man for entertainment. Commodus's sexual behavior, like previous cruel emperors, became increasingly transgressive. He kept a harem of 300 women and 300 boys. He forced senators' wives to sleep with him, then publicly discussed their performance. He committed incest with his sisters, continuing a tradition established by Caligula. The breaking point came in 192 AD. Commodus announced he would begin the new year by emerging from gladiatorial barracks and processing to the Senate as a gladiator, not as emperor. This final degradation of the imperial office was too much, even for those who tolerated his previous excesses. His mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and praetorian prefect Latus formed a conspiracy. On December 31, 192 AD, they tried to poison Commodus. The emperor, drunk, vomited up the poison. Realizing their plot had failed and discovery meant certain death, the conspirators sent Narcissus, a wrestling partner of Commodus, to strangle him in his bath. The emperor, who believed he was Hercules, died ignominiously, strangled while helpless in his bath, killed by the very athletic culture he'd embraced. He was 31 years old and had reigned 12 years. Commodus's death plunged Rome into another civil war, the year of the 5 emperors. The winner, Septimius Severus, was a capable military commander who stabilized the empire. But the damage Commodus had done ran deep. He'd shown the empire could survive even a completely incompetent emperor for over a decade, that the machinery of state could continue functioning even when its head was engaged in elaborate fantasies. Yet for all the cruelty of Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, and Commodus, one more emperor would surpass them all in sheer, concentrated evil. His reign would be short, but in that brief time, he would commit acts that shocked even a Rome inured to imperial cruelty. His name was Elagabalus. The 14-year-old boy stands before the legions, dressed in silk robes embroidered with gold, his face painted with cosmetics, his eyes lined with kohl. The soldiers stare in confusion. This is their new emperor, this child who looks like a Syrian priest? But the boy's grandmother, Julia Maesa, has promised them money, and the current emperor, Macrinus, has failed to pay wages. The legions of Syria proclaim the boy emperor in 218 AD. His birth name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but he took the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus to claim connection to great emperors of the past. History, however, knows him by the name of the god he served, Elagabalus, the Syrian sun god. Elagabalus was born into the Syrian branch of the Severan dynasty. His grandmother Julia Maesa was sister to Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus. When Septimius's son Caracalla was assassinated and the throne usurped by Macrinus, Julia Maesa saw opportunity. She spread rumors that Elagabalus was actually Caracalla's illegitimate son, making him rightful heir. The legions, who'd loved Caracalla despite his cruelty, believed the story or pretended to. Elagabalus arrived in Rome in 219 AD, and from the moment he entered the city, it was clear Rome had never seen an emperor like this. He brought with him the sacred black stone of Emesa, a meteorite representing his god, and installed it in a new temple on the Palatine Hill. He declared Elagabalus the supreme god of Rome, above Jupiter, above all traditional gods. But religious innovation was merely the beginning. Elagabalus's personal behavior scandalized Rome in ways that made even Nero look conventional. The young emperor was sexually omnivorous and completely shameless about it. He took multiple wives, marrying and divorcing them on whim. He married a Vestal virgin, breaking one of Rome's most sacred taboos. When that marriage ended, he married another woman, then another. But his marriages to women were apparently concession to convention, because Elagabalus's true sexual interests lay elsewhere. He took male lovers openly, referring to them as his husbands. He allegedly asked doctors to give him female genitalia. He worked as a prostitute in the imperial palace, setting up a brothel in his own residence and servicing clients personally. These acts weren't done in private. Elagabalus performed them publicly, deliberately transgressing every Roman norm about gender, sexuality, and imperial dignity. He appeared in public dressed as a woman. He wore makeup and wigs. He allegedly offered vast sums to any physician who could surgically transform him into a woman. The cruelty of Elagabalus's reign came not from systematic terror like Tiberius or paranoid purges like Nero, but from complete indifference to Roman values and complete disregard for human dignity. He treated the empire as his personal playground, the Senate as his audience, and Roman citizens as props in his performances. He held banquets where guests were served inedible dishes or seated on whoopee cushions that deflated, dropping them to the floor. He released wild animals during dinner parties, causing panic. He smothered guests under vast quantities of rose petals dropped from the ceiling, allegedly suffocating some. These sound like pranks, but they were pranks with the full force of imperial power behind them. You couldn't refuse an invitation from the emperor. You couldn't leave early. You had to sit through whatever humiliation or danger he devised, smiling and pretending to enjoy it, knowing any sign of displeasure could mean death. Elagabalus appointed his lovers to high positions regardless of qualifications. He made a chariot driver prefect of the Praetorian Guard. He gave military commands to dancers and actors. The machinery of empire, which had survived Commodus's neglect, began breaking down under Elagabalus's active sabotage. The Senate, which had endured so many cruel emperors, found Elagabalus uniquely intolerable. It wasn't just that he was cruel, it was that he violated every norm that made Roman identity coherent. He was a foreigner who didn't even pretend to respect Roman traditions. He was sexually transgressive in ways that challenged Roman concepts of masculinity and power. He was a priest of a foreign god who subordinated Rome's gods to his own. Julia Maesa, who'd engineered Elagabalus's rise, watched with growing alarm as her grandson made himself universally hated. She began promoting Elagabalus's cousin, Severus Alexander, as a more suitable emperor. Elagabalus, sensing the threat, tried to have Alexander killed, but the Praetorian Guard protected the boy. On March 11, 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard mutinied. They stormed the palace, hunting for Elagabalus. The emperor, 18 years old, tried to hide. The guards found him cowering in a latrine with his mother. They killed them both, dragged their bodies through streets, and threw them in the Tiber. Elagabalus had reigned less than 4 years, but in that time he'd achieved something remarkable. He'd made Romans nostalgic for Commodus. At least Commodus had been Roman in his delusions. Elagabalus was something alien. something that didn't fit into Roman categories of understanding. The five emperors, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Commodus, and Elagabalus, each demonstrated a different facet of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. Tiberius showed that cruelty could be systematic and administrative. Caligula proved that madness with unlimited power could terrorize an empire through sheer unpredictability. Nero revealed that weakness and insecurity could be as deadly as strength and confidence. Commodus demonstrated that delusion, when backed by imperial authority, could persist for years despite obvious insanity. Elagabalus illustrated that complete contempt for cultural norms could make an emperor intolerable, even to a society that had tolerated nearly everything else. What's striking about these five emperors isn't just their individual cruelty, but what their reigns reveal about the Roman system. The empire survived them all. After each cruel emperor fell, Rome continued. The legions kept guarding frontiers, the provinces kept paying taxes, the aqueducts kept flowing, the roads kept connecting the Mediterranean world. This resilience was Rome's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The empire was so robust, so well designed, that it could function even when its head was mad, cruel, or incompetent. But this same resilience meant there was no automatic check on imperial cruelty. An emperor could terrorize the Senate, bankrupt the treasury, violate every social norm, and the empire would continue until someone finally worked up courage to assassinate him. The pattern repeated across centuries. A cruel emperor would take power, his behavior would become increasingly intolerable, and finally, the Praetorian Guard or the legions would kill him and install someone new. Sometimes the new emperor was better, sometimes he was worse, but the system itself never fundamentally changed. The legacy of these five emperors extends far beyond Rome. They became archetypes, warnings about what happens when power has no limits. Tiberius's surveillance state, Caligula's capricious terror, Nero's persecution of scapegoats, Commodus's reality-denying delusion, and Elagabalus's contempt for tradition. All these patterns have recurred throughout history whenever power concentrates without accountability. The Roman Empire eventually fell, not because of cruel emperors, but because of economic decline, military pressure, and internal division. But the cruel emperors weakened it, each one eroding a little more of the Senate's authority, the army's discipline, the treasury's wealth, and the people's faith in their government. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson from these five reigns is how normal they became. By the time Commodus took power, Romans had lived through Caligula and Nero. They knew what imperial cruelty looked like. They developed coping mechanisms: keep your head down, applaud when required, never stand out, never attract attention. The empire had learned to function under cruelty, which meant cruelty could persist indefinitely. The five cruelest emperors of Rome weren't aberrations. They were the logical outcome of a system that placed absolute power in the hands of one man, with no institutional checks on his authority. They showed that the question isn't whether absolute power corrupts, but how creatively, how thoroughly, and how long the corruption can persist before someone finally says enough. Rome's experiment with absolute power offers lessons that echo across millennia. Every society that concentrates unlimited authority in a single individual risks discovering what Rome learned: that human nature, given absolute power, tends not toward benevolence, but toward increasingly creative forms of cruelty. The machinery of state that Rome built, its roads, its laws, its administrative systems, proved so robust that it could survive even the worst excesses of its emperors. But survival isn't the same as flourishing, and each cruel reign left scars that never fully healed. The five emperors discussed here represent not just historical curiosities, but cautionary tales about the nature of power itself. They remind us that institutions matter, that checks and balances exist not to frustrate leadership, but to protect society from the inevitable corruption that absolute power brings. They show us that competence and cruelty can coexist, that madness can wear the mask of divinity, that weakness can kill as efficiently as strength. If you found this exploration of Rome's darkest chapter compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most fascinating and troubling moments. Hit that like button if you want to see more content exploring how power corrupts across different civilizations and time periods. Drop a comment below telling us which of these five emperors you found most disturbing and why. Was it Tiberius's cold calculation? Caligula's mad whims? Nero's artistic vanity turned violent? Commodus's delusional violence? Or Elagabalus's complete contempt for Roman values? Your engagement helps us create more content exploring the lessons history offers. And if you're interested in learning more about how absolute power corrupts in different contexts, check out our playlist on ancient world rulers and the systems they built. History's darkest moments teach us the most important lessons about human nature and the structures we need to constrain it. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our next historical deep dive. Thanks for watching, and remember, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.